Hey everybody, Jeppy here, and today we're taking a look at the lore of one of the most powerful killers here in Dead by Daylight, the Nurse. We'll find out why the innocent widow nurse turned evil and insane set out to purify the world from mentally handicapped individuals. It's a good story of what being surrounded by awful things and PTSD will do to the human psyche. So everyone, if you're excited, make sure to leave a like and comment down below which killer or survivor you'd like to see a lore video on in the future. So let's start things off as we always do with where and when the nurse was born. So the nurse's real name was actually Sally Smithson, and she was born in, well, to be honest, I can't find a true date on when she was born. It was probably somewhere between 1857 and probably like 1930. You'll see why I believe it to be somewhere around that time here in a minute. Sally grew up somewhere in the United States, but it's unknown on exactly where. I swear, sometimes the lore in Dead by Daylight can be so vague. Well, anyways, Sally Smithson's childhood is also, well, pretty much non-existent in her lore, but it does start off with Sally and her husband Andrew moving to town with warm thoughts together in their future. Andrew was a lumberjack and moved for work and promised Sally he'd build her a home that they'll live in together and they can have as many babies as Sally wanted. She loved kids and desperately looked forward to the day she has her own, listening to them running around barefoot in the house her husband made. Life was going to be great, but the dreams of a happy life came crumbling apart with just one person's words. One morning, Andrew's boss and foreman on the lumberjack job site knocked on Sally's door with his head held low. He finally mustered up the words to tell her that her husband Andrew was killed today at the job site when a tree collapsed on top of him when cutting it down. She paused, took a step back, and fell to the floor in a puddle of tears. She is all alone now, and as if the loss of her husband wasn't enough, now she needs to get employed somewhere or she'll lose her home too very quickly. She was desperate and running out of food. The only place she can find a job at was a local insane asylum called Crotus Prenn Asylum. Nobody ever wanted to work there unless they were in dire need of employment. So that's where Sally started. Without any education whatsoever on how to care for these people, they hired her and put her directly onto the dreaded night shift. It was an eye-opener to say the least. Crotus Prenn Asylum wasn't the biggest hospital system out there, but it did in fact hold the most clinically insane and dangerous mentally handicapped individuals in the United States. Rumors told from the locals emerged on the atrocities held there. Since Sally worked nights, most of the time she would be the only nurse there. You can already start to see how it would be so hard to keep your sanity surrounded by the insane. Screams and moans ring throughout the halls, bodily fluids, whether vomit, blood, or poop, scattered on the walls and floors, and the constant threat of being verbally and physically assaulted started making Sally paranoid for her safety. The staff had certain nicknames or codes they'd give to some of the patients. For example, some of them were Anxious Girl, Broken Woman, The Bad Man, Rancid Son, just to name a few. They didn't really call them by their actual names. Again, she had no training, so she literally had to learn how to be a nurse while on the job. So with the love of her life dead and the fact she works in a high stress level job, it's understandable how over the years she would slowly but surely lose her sanity. In fact, Sally worked as a night shift nurse for a whole 20 years, 2 decades long of repeatedly getting physically or verbally assaulted, and dealing with the mentally insane definitely took a toll on her psyche. She started getting frustrated and disgusted by the patients more and more frequently, even if it's something that never really bothered her in the past. Sally was at her wit's end and was quite literally on her breaking point. While at work, Sally started having more flashback episodes to her life with her husband or what their future would have looked like. She'll be physically walking the halls, but mentally she was somewhere else. She made her way to a young girl's room she likes to visit that the staff call the Anxious Girl. She is terrified of people, but Sally won her trust over and tends to her care every night. She would often braid the Anxious Girl's hair and talk to her because she was too scared to talk to anyone else, and tried to get the Anxious Girl to muster up some courage to go speak to other people. Just then, a light moan echoed throughout the asylum walls that disturbed the other patients, which in turn made them start screaming and moaning in their beds. Pretty soon, the entire place was filled with the sounds of screams. Sally ran to the room that started it, and it was, of course, the broken woman causing trouble again. This broken woman was completely restrained to her bed and almost covered in head to toe in bandages because she just can't stop damaging her body by ripping at her skin with her fingernails. The broken woman always called Sally sweet nurse, but pretty soon she'll be anything but that. Long story short, this broken woman used to be a nurse too and told stories to Sally about how she quote unquote purified the lands by injecting lethal medicine into a person to, well, kill them. It's horrible and very, very barbaric, but in her mind, she was doing a good thing by helping rid the world of severe mentally handicapped. So this broken woman nurse also worked at an asylum and, well, killed a lot of them. With each passing night, this broken woman fed more and more stories of how she did it and why they need to purify this asylum, until one day a horrific attack occurred at the asylum, which I think is best said coming from the nurse's tome lore itself. Quote, "The days pass, but Sally's unsure how many. She always finds herself back in the asylum, tending to the frantic, the violent, the feeble. Down the hall, the bad man has slipped his restraints again. Like a wolf, he shows no motive but to prowl for the weak, and it appears he's found his prey. He drags the naked body of the rancid son by the ankles. Blood spills from the son's head. Sally does not know if the man is dead. Calling for help, she sprints down the hall with a syringe filled of sedatives. There are no other nurses to come to her aid. Financial restrictions have seen to that. She considers that she is running to her death this time, but there is something involuntary in her movements, as if she has become a spectator. The bad man lets go of the rancid son's ankles and turns his attention to Sally. He fails to notice Harvey Kavana, the plump orderly, round the corner behind him. Harvey slams the bad man into the floor as he's done to so many patients. Sally jabs a sedative into the bad man's neck. The bad man sags in place and with a look of bewilderment falls to the ground, end quote. It goes on to say how Sally had to laugh to stop herself from screaming at the bloody scene left behind that night. The days pass and Sally's slip into madness is coming quicker and quicker. She spends long amounts of time in the broken woman's room listening to her talk and ignoring the needs of the other patients. She has more spells of passing out and seeing her husband, except this time she envisioned his death as she was holding him. A tree landed on him and splinters of wood pierced his skin, leaving a pool of blood. Losing her mind, she snaps back into reality and tries to go to the little anxious girl's room to braid her hair and maybe get some comfort. They chat again, but this time the anxious girl could find something was wrong with Sally. The nurse parted the anxious girl's hair and saw lice everywhere in her scalp and immediately backed off and slapped the girl in the face, shouting, "Filthy, filthy, filthy!" She walks out into the halls and sees the foul girl vomit on the floor, then skip around like nothing happened. Unbothered by the mess, she walks more and sees the shoeless imbecile sitting by the broom closet banging his head on the wall. He reaches into his bleeding mouth and rips out a tooth, but Sally pays no attention. Scanning the halls and rooms, the thought of purification has consumed her. Her sanity is gone. She walks to the med room and fills a syringe with the deadly compounds just like the broken woman told her how to make. A thick black liquid swirls around the syringe. Sally grips the syringe and prepares for what's to come. There is such filth that permeates the asylum. If she is to cleanse it all, she had best begin. Sally first walks through the broken woman's room to exterminate her. Room by room, she injects the helpless patients as if they were animals. But she didn't just stop at the patients. She also went around and killed the staff members as well. No one was safe from the nurse. As the morning shift arrived for work on a cold September day, they opened the doors and what they saw would probably be ingrained into their memories for the rest of their lives. Over 50 dead patients littered the halls and beds. Signs of strangulation and injection sites from the lethal compound was found all over their bodies. Also, 4 night shift staff members were murdered as well. Even the warden named Patrick Spencer was killed, most likely by strangulation. In fact, that's where the nurse's special blinking ability is called, Spencer's last breath. Because as she choked the last breath from Spencer, she used that to somehow formulate her powers when the entity would eventually take her and add the nurse to its realm. Well, the staff finally found Sally as she was huddled in a corner, rocking back and forth nonstop. Her mind was completely gone. They called the ambulance and the medics picked up Sally to take her to the hospital, but that ambulance never made it to the hospital. It was found a couple miles away, crashed near the woods. The medics dead and Sally nowhere to be found. Now, some people in the Dead by Daylight community think that the entity took Sally, aka the nurse, when she ran from the ambulance and was in the woods, but I'm not so sure. And well, here's my theory on it. So if you take a look at the lore of the Crotus Prenn Asylum, which is the map we play on in DBD, we get an interesting story. So the local townspeople were horrified to hear about the mass murder of 50 plus people at the asylum, and it was shortly abandoned after that. But here's the interesting part. The locals would tell stories that they would see a woman living in the abandoned asylum, but were too scared to go inside to confirm it. But one night, they all noticed that there was a huge plume of smoke coming from the asylum. With fires raging, the townspeople did nothing and just let the asylum burn. So I'm thinking that Sally actually lived it out in the woods for a while until the asylum was abandoned and finally died when the fire happened that burned to the ground. That's when the entity claimed the nurse. Well, that's just my theory. So in the entity's realm, I'm still unsure if Sally likes being a killer or not. Now that she lost her mind, she sees everyone inferior to her as imbeciles. But in her mores, she seems to pay respects by closing the eyes of the survivors. Well, of course, right after strangling them, but well, you get the point. Also, while using her ability Spencer's Last Breath to blink through the entity's realm, it seems to be a very painful thing to do as she very obviously screams and screeches as she does it, followed up by a sigh of relief after it. It also looks like her hand and arm is burning as she charges up to blink, which most likely causes her pain as well. I don't know, what do you guys think? Well guys, I think we're all wrapped up with the nurse's lore. Who do you want to see next? And make sure to leave a like and subscribe notifications if you're new. Now with all that being said, Jippy!